Japan and China claim the uninhabited islands known as the Senkaku in Japan and Kyayu in China as their own, but Japan has administered them since 1972. The Senkaku Kyayu Islands were formally claimed by Japan in 1895. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the island chain was controlled by the US until 1971 before its return. Since then, Japan has administered the island chains. China began to reassert claims over the Senkaku Kyayu Islands in the 1970s, citing historic rights to the area. However, Japan does not recognize Chinese claims. More recently, there has been a flare-up in the region. The Japanese government said on Thursday it has protested to China regarding a set of names recently assigned by Beijing to seabed zones in the East China Sea, including the Senkaku Kyayu Islands. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Senkaku Kyayu Islands dispute. Joining me on the program today are Gurjeet Singh, former ambassador, Commander Abhijit Singh, retired, Head Maritime Policy Initiative, Observer Research Foundation, and Srikant Kondapalli, Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. Let's talk about these disputes and what has caused and what has led to the most recent flare-up between China and Japan over the islands and also in the East China Sea region.
Thank you. Many years ago, when I started my career in Japan, one never heard of these islands. Even Okinawa was remote. And Okinawa is a part of the Ryukyu Islands chain, which basically means glazed horned dragon. And the Senkakus are a part of the Ryukyu chain for all practical and political purposes. They were so maintained by the United States after World War II and before World War II by Japan. It is interesting that before World War II, the main island, with the 3 islands and 2 rock faces, were actually owned by a private Japanese family, which tried to do a fisheries business over there, taking in about 200 people to work there, but this business didn't last very long. Subsequently, these islands were in 2012 acquired by the Japanese government and made a part of the Okinawa prefecture. And within Okinawa prefecture, the small town of Ishigaki has administrative control. And it is this town which has now changed the name to Tonoshiro Senkaku to separate it from confusion with another small town called Tonoshiro. When I used to be in Japan, when you talked about contentious island, you always meant the Kurils, which the problem was with the then Soviet Union. This island was never even thought of as being in contention. The contention really begins by the then ECAF, now called SCAF, identifying the areas around this island as possible bearer of oil and gas, which got the Chinese interested, but it also got Taiwan interested. Kindly remember that the closest place to these islands is actually Taiwan. The next is Japan, Okinawa, and then comes China. Now, when Japan owned Formosa, Taiwan, after the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki, when they returned Formosa, the fact that what were the appurtenances to Formosa was never clear. The Chinese and the Taiwanese tend to believe that the Senkakus are part of the Formosan appurtenance, while the Americans and the Japanese are very clear that these are part of the Ryukyu chain. What essentially happens is that the Chinese have become more powerful and more assertive. I don't think they really want to dig for gas over there. They simply want to show the area who's boss. And they are doing it with the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, and they want to do it in the East China Sea by telling Japan to get off, and this is our area. I think in the last month or so, almost 2 months, 70 days in a row, Japanese fishing vessels, sometimes escorted by Coast Guard, have been prowling in these waters, and the Japanese are duly concerned.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about China now. Professor, taking the points that the ambassador was making forward, Why are these islands suddenly so important for the Chinese? The ambassador spoke about how China is just trying to be assertive in the region. Is it just that, or is there more to it?
Well, obviously there is a sovereignty claim, but secondly there is also nationalism factor. There is a clashing Japanese and Chinese nationalism that is also reflective in this island aspects. The third is obviously today China had risen. China's maritime ambitions have increased substantially. And if you look at the map, the Pashu Channel south of Taiwan and the Miyako Bay, these are the areas where during the Cold War, the submarine activity used to be the maximum between the Soviets and the Americans. Today, the Chinese have willfully crossed several times. They have also carried forward the H-6 bombers. And on the Senkaku Islands itself, they have last year some 621 transgressions. I just want to put this in perspective. We have about 426 transgressions on India-China border areas, but 621 transgressions by the Coast Guard and the Chinese Air Force are in the Senkaku Islands. So this has become now a flashpoint. Of course, the Chinese constraint on this is they're raising the bar, but there is a constraint, which is when Obama was the president of the United States, he had given in writing to Yomiuri Shimbun that Senkaku Islands are part of the military alliance between Japan and US. So thereby, there is a new element now. Previously, there was a strategic ambiguity about the alliance responsibilities, but clearly the Senkaku Islands are now part of the overall US-Japan. Of course, under the Trump administration, they have been very quiet. There has not been, and in fact, President Trump has asked for 4 times the current payment by Japan to the US. So it has also added to Japan-US kind of differences. Nevertheless, from a Chinese perspective, there is the US-Japan alliance as a constraining feature. Also, there is the energy factor. Closer to the Senkaku Islands is the Chunqiao Islands, where the Chinese are drilling for oil and gas. But the Japanese accuse the Chinese of, through the underwater pipes, they were able to get the oil from the Japanese claimed EEZ, exclusive economic zone. So there is also the energy problem that is there. In Chinese, Tiayutai means fishing platform. So it is actually good for fisheries. The islands are suddenly you see about 200 meters deep. And so it's good for fishing as well. As you know, nowadays with the increase in food consumption, protein consumption, the fisheries aspect has now become a problematic. You may have heard about China banning fisheries in South China Sea in this season, with which Vietnam had countered, and there has been a sinking of the Vietnamese ship. So fisheries is another factor which is also in the forefront of the Chinese demand in this area.
Absolutely. All right. So, Abhijit Singh, let me bring you to the picture now. Let's talk about the strategic aspects of these islands, really. And also, there was another aspect brought in by the professor, that of the United States and its treaty with Japan. So, if things go south, really, in the region, do you expect the United States really to get involved?
Yeah, at the moment, it doesn't look like the United States would directly get involved into this crisis. The larger problem that we face in the Senkakus is that whilst it is certainly about territoriality and sovereignty, the fact of the matter is that there is a geopolitical aspect to this that is quite complex. Let me just take you back a few weeks to an incident that happened in the waters of the Senkaku when a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, actually there were 2 of these Chinese Coast Guard vessels that were pursuing a Japanese fishing boat. And they entered the territorial waters around the Senkakus. Now, it is not unheard of that Chinese Coast Guard vessels enter these waters. It's happened a few times in the past. But this time it led to a standoff between the Japanese Coast Guard vessels and the Chinese Coast Guard vessels. And the Chinese refused to back off, which came as a shock to the Japanese government. For a good 2 days, the Chinese were right there until they finally withdrew and they went out. And when Japan lodged a formal protest, the Chinese responded that these are Chinese waters and that this ship was actually pursuing a Japanese vessel that was engaged in illegal activities. This is the sort of accusation that the Chinese have never made earlier. So Japanese analysts point out that usually when these Chinese boats come into our waters, it is either if there's a media team which is there on that, a Japanese media team which is there on that fishing boat, or there are some activists that are there. But this time, it seemed as if they were gunning for us with a vengeance. So again, why did this all happen? Again, the regional analysts say that this could all have happened because the Chinese were trying to take advantage of the COVID crisis, trying to, in some ways, assert their claims in the region. And usually when this sort of things happen, the US keeps clear. So the US's understanding is that if it becomes a high-intensity conflict, then those security commitments kick in. If it remains a low-level activity between Coast Guards, the US does not actually intervene. So the US was watching from the sidelines. But this is all that has happened. So what do the Japanese do? What the Japanese do is that they go ahead and they rename the islands. As the ambassador correctly brought out, the islands are no longer called just senkakus. They're now called the Okineiro senkakus, if I can pronounce that correctly. But so the Chinese then go ahead and rename some features in the area themselves. So there is this tit for tat action that is happening there in those regions, and this could be a signal to the Americans to not be too assertive in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Let us remember that there is a larger backdrop to this, is that the Americans have themselves become quite proactive in the South China Sea. There are 3 aircraft carriers at the moment that are operating in the waters of the Philippines. And so the Chinese are trying to push back on all of the contested regions, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's the East China Sea, or it's Ladakh. Everywhere the Chinese are pushing back to essentially show that, you know, Beijing and the Xi Jinping regime cannot be taken for granted by the US. So I see, because there is so much of geopolitics involved in this whole affair, I think it would be very hard for the Americans to take any proactive action at the moment. But if the Chinese continue to be aggressive in the region, and there is, and let's not forget that the Chinese president is due to make a visit to Tokyo sometime soon. If, despite that, they continue to remain aggressive, then I think the Americans will have no option but to send in some deployments, naval deployments in the region.
Okay, all right, Ambassador, taking the discussion forward now. So what does all of this mean for the overall ties between Japan and China?
First, I think regarding the Americans, I think where the East Asia Sea and the South China Sea is concerned, the Americans are adrift. They are not really a potent force. Their 3 aircraft carriers are in the Pacific. The American concern is no more with South China Sea and East Asia, or whatever treaty obligations they may have. They are apprehensive that China may enter the Pacific, which is a direct threat to the United States. That to them is the major threat. I don't think they're coming to the aid of the Philippines, the Vietnamese, or the Japanese. Perhaps what they lack is the political will. And this is because the Japanese have never sought to be confrontational with China or Taiwan in that region. The Japanese, in fact, about maybe a decade ago, actually worked out a fisheries agreement around the Senkaku, saying that the Chinese can come and fish in what are traditional fishing grounds. Nobody will interfere, while we can also fish, but this is not a claim to exercise under the Chinese exclusive economic zone. And the Taiwanese were willing to go along with it. The Chinese attitude is, I will fish here, but I will not agree with it. So the Japanese are finding it very difficult. I think like everybody else is finding it difficult to work with a China which does not want to abide by the rules. If you see the ASEAN Summit Declaration, it again calls for abiding by UNCLOS. And the one thing that China doesn't want to do is use UNCLOS. They want to use traditional fishing areas as the determinant of Chinese sovereignty. Therefore, the Japanese have a problem. The Japanese have a huge amount of investment in Japan. They want to get a part of the companies who are doing critical manufacturing to come back to Japan under a COVID financed subsidy package. They are looking at how to engage with the Chinese in a variety of areas, but they are finding the Chinese more and more difficult. There was a visit by President Xi scheduled for April. Obviously, it didn't happen because of COVID. I don't think it's going to happen very soon. The Japanese have not revised their constitution, but the strength of their self-defense forces continues to rise. The very old cap of 1% of GDP on Japanese defense budget have broken long ago. Today, the Japanese budget is over 2.5% of the GDP. But what Japan needs to reorient is whether it can have a solid skirmish at the Senkakus and hold their own. Over a period of time, the Chinese have challenged them on the sea, they've challenged them in the air. They have got this air defense identification zone over the East China Sea. The Japanese have never imposed their own counter ADIZ, for instance. So therefore, it is for Japan to decide how far they are ready to go to defend their interests. And I think the Chinese are having a slowdown. All these years, these kind of things never happened with the Russians in their Kurils. There was a big domestic agenda, but they were never so threatened by the Russians as they are today. The Chinese are seeking to not only assert themselves, but change the game of power in the East Asian and South China Seas.
Absolutely. So, Professor, since we are here, what is the thinking really as far as all of this is concerned on mainland China, and what is it that they want to achieve?
I think what China wants to achieve is regional hegemony in East China Sea and South China Sea as a gateway to the global hegemony in terms of the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. In 2009, they had the two ocean strategy. And as part of this, they were pushing through these envelopes. During the Cold War, they got stuck with the Soviet-US competition, and many of these sea lanes of communications were blockaded by the US or the Soviets. Today, as China is the second largest economy, and roughly 40% of their GDP dependent on the high seas, there is a forward momentum in the maritime domain. So China wants to master these lanes, sea lanes, as well as control these over a long period of time. So there is a maritime element to their desire in this part. Secondly, there is also a domestic criticism. There are actually 3 or 4 schools of thought within China which suggest that they need to address Japan, because Japan was the first one to defeat China in 1894. And so there is that historical rivalry. It's a rivalry which is much akin to the UK and France in the European history in the 19th century. So if the Chinese are able to overshadow the Japanese, then they will be able to run in Asia in terms of the power equations. So these schools of thought suggest, one, how to address the Japan challenge. Number one, to ignore China completely, to engage with Japan in economic, technological aspects, because this school suggests that while Japanese economy is going down, it is still one of the high-tech places, and it has achieved many of its strategic objectives, like per capita income, health of the society, public health of the society, and various other indicators. Although everybody is aging in that part of the world, Japan still is graduating towards robotics and other technical aids. So the engagement school suggests that we need to engage with Japan for this technological and FDI. Remember, Japan had invested about $280 billion in the China market, And in fact, even during when they were not having any diplomatic relations till about 1972, still a lot of Japanese have invested in China. And there is a very huge lobby in Japan of the business and chambers of commerce, in which they also influence the ruling LDP. So the commercial lobby is quite powerful in Japan, asking for a pro-China position in their policies. In Japanese Foreign Ministry, there is the American school and the China school. The American school gets marginalized whenever there is the engagement process with China on the upswing. So
Right.
the second school suggests that we need to do more engagement. The other, of course, they say that they need to ignore. And there are also some Chinese military generals like Liu Yuan who argue that they need to bomb Japan in any event of the clashes with the Senkaku Islands. So there are various opinions within China,
Sure.
which suggest that there is a churning out process happening in China.
Okay, all right. So, Abhijit Singh, since we're here then, and something that the ambassador spoke about in both his remarks, his opening as well as his previous one, about how China is trying to be more powerful, more assertive really in the region. This is something that the professor also spoke about. So, what are the options really as far as the countries in the East China Sea and South China Sea are concerned? Can anyone really take on China?
Well, there's a certain nuance to what the Chinese are doing in the East China Sea. And I'd like to make a distinction between what the Chinese are trying in the East China Sea and what their strategy seems to be in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, what the Chinese, in a tactical sense, have been trying to do is what has been referred to commonly as the salami slicing strategy, which is to nibble away territory gradually. Now, the Chinese tend to follow this strategy in areas that they physically dominate. So if the Chinese have got these islands, the Spratlys and the Paracels, in which they have, or a lot of them, they have physical control, more in the Paracels than in the Spratlys, they resort to the salami slicing. So in that they have these powerful militias that go around, they're doing reclamation, they're building islands in areas that they don't control. And I would say that the same strategy, we could say, is also being used in places like Ladakh, where they're in a position of strength and they're trying to nibble away at disputed territory. But in areas that China does not dominate, for instance, the East China Sea, where Japan is in domination, what the Chinese try is what I have termed as incremental expansionism. So essentially, what they do is that they send in their military and non-military boats and ships, more non-military than military. So let's keep in mind that the PLA Navy does not play a very active role in the East China Sea disputes, but it does on occasions. But generally, the Coast Guard is always there, and the Japanese analysts now say that it has been almost 3 months that these Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been surrounding the Senkaku Islands. It used to be, their presence used to be episodic. They used to come here about 4 or 5 days, sometimes in a month. That has gone down to 2 weeks. That has gone up to 2 weeks to 3 weeks, and now they're there usually virtually all the year round. So this incrementalism tends to create a picture that it's par for the course for Chinese to be present in this region, that this is disputed territory. This is as much Chinese, or rather the Chinese claims to the region are as legitimate as the claims of, say, Japan, in fact, more legitimate than Japan. And that, in turn, then sort of makes holes in Japan's defense that these are Japanese islands, that these have been held by Japan for the last many years. And it confirms those territories as disputed territories. Now, why this is interesting for some of the other countries in the region, including India, is that if you look at what the Chinese are doing off the waters of Indonesia and of the waters of Malaysia, with the Lakonia Shoals and with the Natuna Islands, is exactly expansionism, incremental expansionism. They don't control the territories in those areas, but they're there in numbers, and they're trying to gain stakeholdership for themselves in the region. And I see a similar strategy play out in the Andaman Seas. So you will have more Chinese ships come into the region. Already we have their mining vessels, we have fishing vessels coming into the Andamans, we have intelligence ships coming into the Andamans. And as you go into the future, there will be more, vessels like research vessels, survey vessels, to say that India should accept more of Chinese presence in the Bay of Bengal. It's par for the course for Chinese to China to be present in this. So I think this is not simply about domination. It is, of course, in main part about domination, but it's also about Chinese stakeholdership in waters that they consider contested or waters that they consider of interest to China. And I think that's the important point that we should note.
Okay, time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests. I've got limited time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief with the best way forward, starting first with the Ambassador.
Well, I think the Japanese have to learn a new tactic, a new strategy. They can't buy their way out of this one. If they want to hold on to the Senkakus, they really have to step up their act. Simply doing what Professor Kondapalli said, but that the lobby of industrialists will hold your foreign policy and defense policy is not going to work. The Chinese are not letting you have that. Second, the Chinese have gobbled the Scarborough Shoal, the Paracels, the Spratlys. This Senkaku is next. They don't want to leave this consistent presence over almost 2 or 3 months in that zone shows their intent. Now it is for Japan to show its intent and stand up for what it believes. If it does not, it has repercussions for all of us, including India and the Quad.
Okay, all right, Professor.
In 1972, when the diplomatic relations were established between Japan and China, Japan agreed to Taiwan being part of China without any reciprocal responses from Japan on the Senkaku Islands or on others. Interestingly, during that time, Zhou Enlai, the premier, said that they do not have time to resolve the Senkaku Islands, discussed this with the Japanese Prime Minister Ikeda, and we also see a similar response by Zhou Enlai in relation to India-China border areas when he said in 1960 that China does not have time to resolve this problem. So I think there is Japan and India need to get together on the sovereignty-related issues. And interestingly, India and Japan did not comment on each other's sovereignty aspects, except Mr. Taro Aso, who mentioned about Arunachal Pradesh. But we have not had any mutual discussion on the sovereignty-related aspects. Right. If India and Japan do not come together on this, and we're going to see a larger problem for both of them in the coming future.
Okay, all right. And Abhijit Singh, close the show for us with your quick concluding remark.
Well, I would just say that I think the Japanese understand Chinese geopolitics, Chinese political intentions very well. And I think what they're going to do is play the waiting game here. There have been a number of Japanese analysts in recent days that have written about the Senkaku dispute, and they've said that this seems to be a problem with the CCP, a problem wherein President Xi seems to be under increasing pressure domestically. And as long as he is under pressure because of COVID or because of the state of the economy or whatever it might be, we are going to see increasing aggression by China in these waters. It does not mean that China wants to actually go to war. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see robust action being initiated by Japan at the moment, because they are waiting to see how far China is going to take things, how much they're going to up the ante. That said, right. I think the Japanese are going to cooperate with India, both in the Indian Ocean as well as the East China Sea, if India desires to do so. And I think we should take full advantage of the Japanese desire to create a counter to China in both these areas. Thank you.
Okay, all right. With that, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you.